Most of the time when I'm out doing landscape photography, I'm able to capture the scene as I want it in one exposure, and that's fantastic. It makes life much easier. However, there are scenes which are much more difficult to capture, and you need to take a number of exposures. Recently, a few days ago, I was out photographing a coastal scene near sunset, and I had to take a number of exposures in order to get the final result that I wanted. And while doing that, I had to use 3 different techniques on location to help me get the images that I wanted. And in this video, I'm going to discuss these 3 techniques that I used and give you some tips and pointers to try and help you if you need to use them as well. So I've arrived at the scene which I photographed a few days ago, and it looks quite different now at this moment from what it did when I photographed it. When I took the photograph, it was at sunset, very close to sunset. There was a beautiful sky and there was some nice light on little parts of these rocks around me. The video may be overexposed at the moment in terms of the sky behind me, but this area is quite dark, so I've got no real option regarding that. But anyway, before I get on to having a look at this scene in a bit more detail and discussing the 3 techniques I used to help me capture it, I just want to say that obviously being digital photography, once you capture these images using the techniques that I'll discuss, you will need to do some editing, and you're going to need a little bit of software knowledge to do that. Now, I'm not going to cover that in this video because I really want to concentrate on the on-location techniques. I think they're most important. Get these wrong, no matter how good your skills are at home in terms of your editing software, you're not going to get the result that you want. So you really need to get the on-location stuff correct. Plus there'll be lots of tutorials already on the editing side of this. But anyway, let's have a look at the scene and discuss the 3 techniques that I used. So you'll now be able to see this scene in a little bit more detail. It's not the exact composition that I took the other evening, but it lets you have a better look at the scene. There's some really interesting rocks, and you can maybe picture it with a beautiful colourful sky off in the distance with the sun just above the horizon about to set, and little glimpses of golden light on some of these rocks here. So in terms of capturing this scene in one exposure, the first obstacle that I encountered which stopped me doing that was dynamic range. As I touched on earlier when speaking about this video, the dynamic range of the scene was just pushing the capabilities of my camera a little bit too much. Now, when I'm doing landscape photography, in terms of capturing dynamic range, most scenes I capture, I get them in one exposure, but occasionally I need to take more than that, and often I find that 2 is plenty, and that was the case here. So I set up an exposure based on what I would need for my foreground and midground, so the rocks and the sea. And then the sky was the brightest part of my scene, and obviously the sun was there as well, and we'll get on to that in just a minute. So I set up another exposure to capture the sky correctly. And it's always really important to be very careful about your exposure and capture the scene as best as you can in camera. So I set one up so I wouldn't be clipping any of the dark areas, the shadows for my foreground and midground. And then I set up another exposure for the sky. And this is what I want to talk about in just a little bit more detail. I often find that when people are photographing a sky and there's a very bright area such as the sun, they darken the exposure a little bit too much. Now, when I was stood here the other evening looking out at the sun was incredibly bright. I don't often or always shoot towards the sun, but in this case I was, and it was incredibly bright. It was too bright for me to look at, and I couldn't see any detail in the sun. And what I find that some people tend to do is that they underexpose, so they're trying to reduce their exposure, darken their exposure so much so that there's no clipping at the right hand side. But realistically, and it's only my opinion, if there's a really bright sun in your shot, then there is going to be some clipping at the right hand side of the histogram. So I set up my exposure based on that with just a little bit of clipping. I'm not saying to overexpose your images because that can be terrible and there's no way back from that, but If there's just a little bit of clipping for the sun and the sun's very bright in your image, then in my opinion that is absolutely fine, and that's how I set up my second exposure here. So just something to think about. These are all my ideas, what I do. It doesn't mean they're right, it doesn't mean they're wrong. Other people will do things differently, but always be very careful with your exposures. And if the sun is in your scene and it's incredibly bright, don't be afraid of clipping just a little bit to the right hand side of the histogram. It was quite overcast when I arrived here today, but there are moments where the sun is breaking out and it's putting some light into this area, but at the moment it's became quite overcast again. But anyway, when I was here the other evening, issue 2 that I had to deal with when taking this photograph was lens flare. I was getting lens flare in some of my shots. So I was pointing the camera off in this direction behind me. The sun was in my frame, it was bright, and it was causing lens flare. Now, there are some techniques you can use in software such as Photoshop and try and deal with that when you get back home. What I prefer to do is try and eliminate lens flare from some of my images on location, and then finish off by blending a couple of images together in post-processing. I think it's a much easier, much better result doing it that way. So what I like to do is, once I've got my shot set up, if the sun is in the shot and it's causing lens flare, what I like to do is basically take my thumb or a couple of fingers, perhaps down from the top of my frame or in from the side, whichever is nearest the sun, and obscure the sun, and I'll take an image. And that basically means I've got the whole scene, obviously with my hand or my fingers or thumb in the shot, but there's no lens flare. Then I'll take my hand out of the way and take another image, and that lets me capture the sun, but there's obviously some lens flare. And then what I do is I go home and into Photoshop, and I'll open those two images in Photoshop, and I'll blend in the parts that I want. So for example, I could take the whole image with my hand in it and no lens flare, and then just paint in, using masks, the sun and the area around the sun which my hand has been blocking, and that means I get a nice clean image free of lens flare. And that's something I did here the other evening, and yeah, it worked really well. So maybe you can see in this nice little pool of seawater just behind me here, there's a nice reflection, and I really noticed and liked that the other evening, and it sort of mirrors the shape of the rock just to my right as well. So you'll see those features in the final image once I show you it later in this video. But in terms of me being here a few evenings ago taking this photograph, the next issue that I encountered was regarding depth of field and getting my image sharp from front to back. Now, I don't always want my images completely sharp from front to back when I'm taking landscape images. And thinking about it, I think I've spoken about this quite a bit in previous videos. Sometimes I may want the foreground to be soft, sometimes I may want the background to be soft, sometimes I may want both the foreground and background to be soft. It really depends how I'm feeling about the scene that I'm photographing. But in this case, I definitely wanted the whole thing sharp from front to back. So off in the horizon, they'll be quite small in my final image, but there were some hills that were visible. They're still there obviously today as well, but you may find it harder to see them in the video. I definitely wanted those sharp. Coming in from the right of my frame, there's some rocks and there were some seabirds on those. I wanted that sharp, and obviously all of these rocks as well. But most importantly, and the issue that I encountered, was this rock here. Regardless of where I focused, regardless of my aperture, I was going to struggle to get this as sharp as I wanted, and my camera was very close to this rock, and it's a key part of the image, and I definitely wanted it sharp. I really liked the seaweed on it. There's some really nice shells, and I think the side of it from memory was just getting the last of the evening's light as well. So I wanted this sharp. So I had to focus stack. I had to take two different exposures focused on different areas, one to my right and one on this rock, blend them together in post-production to get the whole thing sharp. And the tip that I want to give regarding this, and I think it's really important, and I don't really hear it talked about a lot, is really think about your your exposures that you're taking and how you're going to blend them together, and try and ensure that the area where they blend together, you've got it in focus in both images. As I spoke about earlier, the light really is changing tonight. It's very overcast at the moment. It looks like it's going to rain, but anyway, let's try and explain what I'm talking about here. So getting back to taking this photograph the other evening of this scene, I was giving a lot of thought and paying a lot of attention to thinking ahead into post-production and where would I blend my two images together to get complete sharpness from front to back. So I knew I would be taking one image, blending it in of this rock, and there would be a transition line around the top, the edge of this rock, into another image to get the rest of it sharp. And the tip that I want to give is to really think about this and try and ensure that if possible, it's not always going to be possible depending on your scene, but for me it was key to try and get this top area sharp in both images to ensure a nice easy blend later in Photoshop. So for example, if you took an image focused on this rock and it got it nice and sharp, but the sharpness stopped say a foot or two beyond this rock, and then you took another image and that large rock behind it was nice and sharp, but sharpness fell off, you know, a few feet before you got to this rock. Once you try and blend in this rock and you get to the edge, you're going to find that once you blend in the other image, it's going to be soft in the background. And it's incredibly difficult, nigh on impossible, to just go around the very edges of this rock, take it from one image, and then use another image for everything behind it. So think about your transition point. And for me, in this image here the other evening, it was key that I tried to get this top area of the rock sharp in both exposures to try and ensure a nice easy blend later in Photoshop. So definitely something to think about, and I think that will help you when you're doing a focus stack. So those are the three techniques that I had to use here the other evening in order to get the end result that I wanted. So I created quite a number of different exposures. I worked on them in Lightroom and in Photoshop, got them all together to produce the final result, which is this photo you're going to see now. I do hope you found this video interesting and helpful in terms of your own photography, and I really do appreciate you watching. If you have enjoyed it and found it useful, please take a second to give it a thumbs up, give the video a like rating, and if you're not yet subscribed to my channel and you've liked this video, then why not subscribe to see the rest of my videos that I publish in the future. But for now, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and hopefully I'll see you in my next one.
Remember hearing ancient scenes still rolling over the trees in windswept waves. Remember here that when waiting dreams feel broken. Remember dear that all things change.